At precisely 4:47 a.m. on a wintry Friday, while most of Britain remained asleep, Buckingham Palace issued a declaration so conclusive that even veteran royal reporters used to analyzing diplomatic nuance stared at their monitors in sheer disbelief. The medical advisors for His Majesty have concluded that further intervention is no longer yielding results. The king is currently undergoing final comfort care within the confines of Windsor Castle. Immediate family members have been notified and are presently convening at His Majesty's side. 29 words offering no cushion and no false optimism, just the hard reality that King Charles III, who waited 7 decades to ascend and served for barely 3 years, was passing away. This proclamation arrived with zero notice, lacking the usual sequence of medical updates that generally ready a country for a royal passing. One instant, the official narrative held that the king was undergoing treatment, handling his ailment, and sustaining reduced obligations. The following instant, the palace verified what everyone dreaded, yet nobody wished to articulate, which was that Charles faced his closing hours. There would be no recuperation, no miraculous turnaround, and no gradual twilight that might afford his family years rather than mere days. The BBC cut into its scheduled morning broadcast mere seconds after the statement was made public. The anchor's voice wavered slightly as she recited the text to a population waking up to realize its second Elizabethan era had concluded. Consequently, something novel, unstable, and infinitely more sorrowful had commenced. Sky News initiated its complete morning contingency plans with graphics already designed for this event flashing on monitors with unsettling velocity. Over in the United States, where it was still late Thursday evening, CNN's breaking news banner interrupted prime time with a gravity that made even American hosts used to royal spectacle pause to compose themselves. Beyond the walls of Windsor Castle, the initial mourners started gathering pre-dawn, looking like apparitions in the gloom, pulled by a sorrow they could not voice and a drive to witness history they hoped would be delayed. An older lady, who had once stood in queue for 15 hours to see Queen Elizabeth's casket, now waited at the gates with tears running down her cheeks. "He scarcely had any duration," she whispered softly to nobody specific. He anticipated this his entire life, and they granted him hardly any time whatsoever. Within Kensington Palace, William had been up since 3:30 a.m., passing a restless night following a phone call from Windsor's head doctor cautioning that Charles's status had worsened significantly. The formal palace declaration validated what that private conversation had already steeled him for. Yet, viewing those words in stark black font on his smartphone screen solidified it in a manner the late-night medical report had not. His father was fading away, not hypothetically, nor eventually, but right now. Today, within a few hours, or possibly just minutes. Catherine discovered him positioned by his study window, still dressed in yesterday's outer, gazing out at a darkness that had not yet given way to morning. She did not inquire if he was okay, as if that would have been ridiculous. Rather, she merely took her place next to him, her hand locating his, providing the only solace available when solace itself seemed insufficient. The kid's William eventually spoke his voice gravelly from tears he had wept in solitude. "They must say farewell, George, particularly. He is mature enough to comprehend and old enough to regret it eternally if we do not permit him." Catherine signaled agreement, already mentally bracing for the impossible chore of rousing their children before dawn to inform them their grandfather was passing. She had to tell them they needed to depart instantly, and this might be the final time they saw him living. "I will get them up," she uttered gently. "You telephone ahead and let Windsor know we are en route." Inside 20 minutes, the Wales family was traveling in a convoy speeding through vacant London avenues toward Windsor, flanked by security officers who grasped the necessity well enough to exceed speed limits that would usually be prohibited. George remained quiet, gazing through darkened glass at a metropolis that appeared alien in the pre-dawn gloom. Charlotte wept softly, her cheek pushed against Catherine's shoulder. Meanwhile, Louis, being too little to fully understand the finality of impending events, simply gripped his mother's hand and inquired repeatedly when they would get there. At Windsor, Princess Anne had been in attendance all night, having never departed after taking the initial phone call regarding Charles's decline. She had observed her brother drift in and out of awareness, held his hand during brief moments of clarity when he appeared to know her, and stood by as the medical staff gradually accepted what they had been evading. There was nothing further to be achieved. The therapy had been unsuccessful. The illness had prevailed, and all that was left was controlling discomfort and affording the king whatever dignity could be maintained in passing. Camilla had not abandoned Charles's side since the prior afternoon, when his respiration became difficult, and his spans of alertness became briefer and more disoriented. She remained seated by his bed, clasping his hand, talking to him gently even when he could not reply, sustaining her presence, because presence was the only thing she had left to give. The queen consort, who had battled so tenaciously to stand with him, and who had endured decades of public scrutiny to attain this station, now confronted the harshest irony of all. She was going to lose him before they had scarcely commenced the reign they had waited so long to experience together. As morning light broke over Windsor Castle, coloring the ancient masonry in hues of pink and gold that seemed inappropriately lovely, considering the events inside the royal family gathered for the vigil, every family fears. Yet it is a vigil none can escape. The waiting, the observing the intolerable passage of minutes when someone you cherish is fading, and all you can do is exist for the departure. To comprehend how the palace arrived at this moment of crushing finality, we must go back 72 hours, when Charles's status, though grave, still held the potential for leveling off. The medical squad, directed by Dr. Sarah Chen and backed by experts from across Europe, had been handling his cancer therapy with vigorous measures that purchased time but exacted a heavy toll. However, on Tuesday afternoon, during what was supposed to be a standard examination, the monitoring devices displayed something disturbing. Charles's organ performance was failing far more swiftly than forecasted. The malignancy, which had appeared contained, had spread in manners the scans had not picked up. What they had been addressing as a manageable condition had mutated into something critical and permanent. The medical group called an urgent meeting. Dr. Chen delivered the results with clinical exactness, but everybody grasped what the statistics implied. They were no longer handling a chronic condition. They were now confronting terminal disease. Professor Michael Hartley, the lead oncologist, uttered the phrase nobody else wished to say. We must discuss palliative comfort measures. We must ready the family for the likelihood that we are looking at days rather than weeks or months. That night, Dr. Chen sat with Charles to clarify that the therapy was no longer effective, that his body was yielding despite their supreme efforts, and that the moment had arrived to pivot focus from healing to comfort. Charles heard this with a calmness that shattered her heart, inquiring about technical details regarding time frames and indicators. How long, he eventually queried, his voice stable. Days, maybe a week if we are lucky. The deterioration will probably be swift once it commences in earnest. Charles nodded deliberately, stating, I must speak with William. There are matters that must be voiced, plans that must be settled, and constitutional issues that cannot wait for emotions. That discussion took place late Tuesday night behind locked doors. Those nearby reported hearing elevated voices, succeeded by long silences and then unmistakable weeping, when William eventually came out nearly 2 hours later. His face was ruined by tears, and his poise was totally demolished. He fell into Catherine's embrace with sorrow so fresh that even tough security officers had to avert their gaze. By Wednesday morning, Charles's deterioration had quickened noticeably. He stayed awake but increasingly muddled, drifting between current awareness and confused states. Camilla observed how his grasp on her hand had enfeebled and how his replies became delayed and occasionally irrational. The medical staff verified the illness had started impacting his neurological capabilities. Wednesday afternoon introduced the first genuine emergency. Charles underwent what the medical team cautiously described as an acute incident. His heart had momentarily ceased necessitating urgent assistance. The physicians stabilized him, yet Dr. Chen took Camilla aside and clarified with crushing softness that these incidents would become more common and eventually one would happen that they could not undo. So the time to assemble family was now. Thursday was distinguished by extended spans of unresponsiveness broken by short intervals of hazy wakefulness. During one clear instant, Charles requested Anne, who arrived instantly, tell William he struggled out. Tell him it is not a load, it is a gift. Tell him I was proud every single day. Anne clasped his hand, tears running down her face, and vowed she would. By Thursday evening, Charles had entered what the medical staff termed the active passing phase. His respiration became difficult and erratic. His spans of awareness became shorter and more spaced out. His body was ultimately yielding. Dr. Chen, her voice heavy with feeling, made the call to the communication squad. Draft the announcement as the king was fading and the country needed to be informed. The declaration was issued at 4:47 Friday morning. Time to hit early news broadcasts, permitting the nation to wake to the reality rather than encounter it abruptly. And as Britain awoke into consciousness, the royal family convened at Windsor to witness an ending no amount of rehearsal could make tolerable. The emergency call went out at 3:32 Friday morning. Cautiously encrypted messages that nonetheless conveyed distinct urgency. Arrive instantly, final hours, no delays. The palace had devised protocols for precisely this situation, yet nothing encompassed the human burden of waking people pre-dawn to inform them a loved one was passing. William had been awake already, unable to rest. When his phone chimed with the specific ringtone kept for palace crises, He knew before answering what the call would convey. How long, he inquired instantly. Hours at best, Sir Clive Alderton responded. Dr. Chen suggests you return as quickly as possible, and Your Royal Highness, if the children desire to say farewell, now is the moment. He might not remain conscious much longer. The ride to Windsor felt simultaneously infinite and too short. George sat stiffly erect, attempting to personify the stoic fortitude he believed a future monarch should show, yet his hands shook. Charlotte had ceased weeping, entering a numb zone beyond tears. Louis kept asking queries nobody could resolve. Would Grandpa know they were present? Would it hurt? Why could the doctors not repair him? Catherine replied with cautious truthfulness. Sometimes people's bodies become so ill that medicine cannot make them well. Grandpa's body is extremely sick, and the doctors have performed everything they can. So now we are going to be with him to hold his hand, to let him know how much we cherish him. At Windsor, Princess Anne had spent the last hour making calls to extended kin, her voice becoming rougher with each chat. Edward and Sophie were already en route from Bagshot Park. Beatrice and Eugenie had been alerted, although the palace had quietly intimated their attendance might cause crowding at a time when immediate family required space. The most complex call had been to Harry in California, where it was still Thursday evening. Anne reached him on his cell phone. "You must come now," she stated bluntly. "Commercial flights will not arrive on time. Speak with the palace about plans for private transport. Your father is passing away, Harry. If you wish to say farewell, you must depart instantly. Harry's trip would become its own tragedy, a race against the clock he would ultimately lose." Even with private jets and priority clearances, the physics of transatlantic travel meant he would not arrive until late Friday afternoon, hours after the moment he was frantically rushing to reach. The medical suite had been converted into a space balancing clinical need with family privacy. Monitoring gear hummed softly in corners. Seats had been positioned around Charles' bed for the immediate family. The illumination had been lowered to something gentler than institutional brightness. Camilla had not left Charles's side since the release of the early morning statement. She sat near his bed, one hand clasping his, the other resting on his chest, where she could feel each labored breath. Her face was ruined by fatigue and sorrow, her makeup long since washed away. When William arrived with Catherine and the kids, Camilla looked up with eyes full of agony. "He has been waiting for you," she said softly. "He drifts in and out, but when he is conscious, he asks for you." William neared slowly, almost fearful to see what his father had become. Charles lay against pillows, his face pale and gaunt, his breathing shallow and erratic. But when William took his hand, Charles's eyes fluttered open, and clarity pierced the fog. "William," he managed, "you arrived." "Certainly I came," William said, tears flowing freely. "I'm here, Dad. We are all here." Charles's gaze shifted slowly around the room, lingering longest on his grandchildren. George stepped forward and took his grandfather's hand. "We love you, Grandpa," he said, his voice cracking. "Thank you for everything." Encircled by family in the pre-dawn darkness, King Charles III seemed to find a peace that had evaded him during the long night of decline. His breathing, while still difficult, became slightly more regular. His look softened into something resembling contentment. He was not alone. He would not pass away alone. As dawn broke fully over Windsor Castle, Charles drifted between states of consciousness with increasing frequency. The clear moments grew shorter, the confused periods longer. But when awareness surfaced, he seemed resolved to use whatever time remained for things that mattered, for words that needed saying. During one span of clarity, Charles gripped William's hand with surprising power and pulled him closer. "You will be a better king than I was," he said. Each word required effort that was painful to watch. "You have had time to prepare that I never had time to watch, to learn to understand what works and what does not. Do not waste it trying to be me. Be yourself. Be the king this century needs, not the one my mother's era required." William could not speak, could not force words past the grief stuck in his throat. He simply nodded and held on, as if physical contact alone could keep his father tethered to life a little longer. Catherine stepped forward, then kneeling beside the bed. "Thank you," she said gently, "for welcoming me into this family, for believing I could do this, for supporting us through everything. I will take care of him. I will take care of all of them. I promise." Charles's expression shifted into something approaching a smile. "I know you will. You are stronger than you know, both of you. Strong enough for what comes next." His gaze moved to the children. "George," he called weakly. The boy stepped forward immediately, his composure finally breaking. "Yes, Grandpa." Being king is not about the crown or the throne or the ceremonies. It is about service, about using whatever power you have to make things better for people who have less power than you do. Remember that. When the weight feels unbearable, remember that service is what gives it meaning. George nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I will remember, I promise." Charlotte and Louis came forward then, and Charles managed to say something to each of them. Words are meant only for their ears, private gifts of love delivered in whispers. Anne, who had maintained her characteristic composure throughout the morning, finally allowed motion to show when Charles called her name. She moved to his side immediately. "I am here," she said simply. "You were always the strongest," Charles told her, "the one who understood duty without needing to be taught. I relied on that. William will too. Do not let him forget to lean on you when he needs to. I will not." Anne promised, her voice rough with unshed tears. "Rest now. We will take care of everything." Camilla remained beside the bed, her hand never leaving Charles's. When the family had finished their goodbyes, she leaned close to her husband, speaking softly enough that no one else could hear. Charles seemed to relax after whatever Camilla said, as if permission had been granted to stop fighting, to let go. His breathing began to slow further. The pauses between breaths grew longer. Dr. Chen approached William quietly. "Your Royal Highness," she said softly, "it is time. The next few minutes, perhaps an hour at most, you should all be close." The family gathered around the bed, each finding a position where they could maintain physical contact. George stood beside William, Charlotte pressed against Catherine's side. Louis stood silent, his eyes wide. Anne positioned herself at the foot of the bed. Camilla remained in her chair, both hands holding his. Outside the medical suite, palace staff assembled in corridors. Constitutional officials prepared documents. Communications teams reviewed statements. Throughout Britain, people waited, understanding that history was unfolding behind the ancient walls of Windsor Castle. Inside the room, time seemed to slow. Charles' breathing grew more labored, each inhalation requiring visible effort. His eyes remained closed, but occasionally his fingers would tighten slightly around Camilla's hand or William's. At 8:43 in the morning, Charles drew a breath that rattled slightly in his chest. The pause that followed stretched longer than the ones before, then another breath, shallower, weaker. Another pause, even longer, and then so gently it was almost imperceptible. He simply stopped. King Charles III was gone. Dr. Chen stepped forward, checking for vital signs she already knew she would not find. After a moment, she looked at William and shook her head. "I am sorry. His Majesty has passed." Camilla collapsed forward, her body racked with sobs. Anne's face crumpled. Catherine pulled the children close, and William felt the weight of kingship settle onto him like a physical force. He was no longer the Prince of Wales. He was no longer the heir. He had become King William V. Sir Clive Alderton approached with formality that felt surreal. "Your Majesty," he said, the title landing like a blow. "I am deeply sorry for your loss. When you are ready, there are immediate constitutional matters that require your attention." The minutes following Charles's passing moved with terrible efficiency that left no room for grief. William now, King William. Though he had not yet processed that transformation, stood frozen beside his father's body, while the machinery of constitutional transition activated around him with ruthless precision. There were protocols for this moment, centuries of tradition dictating exactly what must happen when a British monarch dies. Dr. Chen officially pronounced the time of death at 8:43 in the morning, her voice steady despite the tears on her face. His Majesty King Charles III passed peacefully surrounded by his family. The clinical language felt inadequate for what they had witnessed, but it created an official record that would become part of history. Camilla, still seated beside the bed, refused to release Charles's hand, even as palace staff began moving around the room. "I need a moment," she said, her voice broken. "Please, just a moment more." Anne moved to her side, placing a hand on her shoulder, and together they sat in silence, while the woman who had been queen consort said a private goodbye. Sir Clive Alderton, carrying a leather portfolio containing emergency constitutional documents, approached with careful respect. "Your Majesty." He began using that title that felt foreign and wrong. "The Prime Minister has been notified and is requesting an audience. There are documents requiring immediate signature, including the accession proclamation." William looked at him blankly, his mind unable to shift from son mourning his father to king managing a constitutional crisis. Catherine, seeing his paralysis, stepped forward. "Give him 10 minutes, she said firmly. "His father just passed away. The crown can wait 10 minutes. But even as she said it, everyone understood that the crown could not actually wait. The moment Charles drew his final breath, William became king. There was no gap, no transition period. The legal continuity of the monarchy demanded it, and, always practical even in grief, took charge of immediate family needs. "The children need to leave," she said quietly to Catherine. "They have said their goodbyes. They do not need to be here for what comes next." Catherine nodded, gathering George, Charlotte, and Louis, all three stunned into silence. George moved like a sleepwalker, his young mind trying to process not just his grandfather's passing, but the knowledge that his father was now king. Charlotte clung to her mother, face buried against Catherine's side. And Louis, finally understanding that something terrible and permanent had happened, began to cry with the abandoned grief only young children can express. As Catherine shepherded the children from the room, William finally moved, stepping away from his father's bedside to face Sir Clive. "What needs to happen first?" he asked, his voice hollow but functional. Sir Clive opened his portfolio. "First, you will meet with the Accession Council, which will convene later today. Before that, you need to approve the announcement of His Majesty's passing." William read the prepared statement that would tell the world his father was dead. Simple, direct, devastatingly final. He signed his approval with a trembling hand, authorizing the message that would plunge Britain into mourning. The statement was released at 9:15, 32 minutes after Charles's passing. Within seconds, every major news outlet interrupted programming. Across Britain, millions received alerts on their phones. King Charles III has passed away. At Windsor Castle, as the world absorbed this news, William was led to a private study where the Accession Council would gather within hours. Constitutional experts briefed him on ceremonies ahead, the proclamations that must be read, and the oaths he would swear. Anne joined him in that study. "You need to call Harry," she said quietly. "He should hear it from you, not from a statement or the news." William had almost forgotten that his brother was somewhere over the Atlantic, racing desperately to reach a bedside he would never reach in time. When Harry answered, his voice tight with hope and fear, William delivered words no brother should have to say. "Harry, I am so sorry he is gone. Dad passed away about an hour ago. You did not make it in time." The sound that came through the phone was somewhere between a sob and a wail, raw grief unfiltered by distance or protocol. "I was trying," Harry said finally. "I was trying so hard to get there." "I know," William replied, his own tears falling. "He knew you were coming. We told him it mattered." When William finally ended the call, he sat for a moment in the quiet study, allowing himself one final minute of being simply a son who had lost his father, before returning to the corridor where duty and crown waited with implacable patience. By mid-morning, Windsor Castle had transformed into the operational center of a constitutional transition that felt like controlled chaos, barely maintaining order. The Accession Council assembled in the throne room with remarkable speed, its members having been on standby for this exact moment. William entered in a dark suit rather than ceremonial regalia. His face was ravaged by grief, eyes red from tears, but his posture remained straight, his voice steady when he spoke the required words acknowledging his accession to the throne. "I am deeply aware of this great inheritance and of the duties and heavy responsibilities of sovereignty which have now passed to me," he said, reading from prepared text while Catherine stood beside him. "In taking up these responsibilities, I shall strive to follow the inspiring example I have been set." His voice cracked slightly. On inspiring example, a brief crack in composure that revealed the son grieving beneath the sovereign's formal language. The Privy Council members swore their allegiance to the new king. "I do become your liege man of life and limb," each intoned in turn, the medieval phrasing carrying weight precisely because of its antiquity. Outside Windsor Castle, crowds had swelled to thousands. Flowers began piling against the gates, messages of condolence that would be archived as part of history. An elderly military veteran stood at attention for over an hour, tears streaming down his face. The formal proclamation of William's accession took place at 11:30, precisely 2 hours and 47 minutes after Charles's passing. The Garter King of Arms read the proclamation from St. James's Palace, his voice carrying across a crowd silent with grief and anticipation. The proclamation was repeated across the United Kingdom, each ceremony marking the constitutional reality that Britain had a new sovereign, whether the nation felt ready or not. Back at Windsor, William faced his most personally devastating task, his first address to the nation as king. The speech had been drafted weeks earlier, but no preparation could make this moment less brutal. He sat alone in a temporary broadcast studio and tried to find words adequate for the grief he could barely process. When the camera's red light activated, William began speaking to a nation mourning alongside him. "I speak to you today as your king, though I wish with all my heart that I was speaking to you instead as a son who still had his father. My father, King Charles III, passed peacefully this morning at Windsor Castle. He was surrounded by family. He knew he was loved, and he faced the end with the courage and grace that defined his entire life." William paused, visibly struggling to maintain composure. "My father dedicated his life to service, cared deeply about the future of our planet and the welfare of all people. He waited longer than any heir in British history to become king. And when that moment came, he embraced it with complete dedication." The camera captured everything. The tears William could not suppress, the tremor in his voice, the weight settling visibly onto his shoulders. His time as sovereign was too brief, but in those years he showed us what it means to serve with integrity, to lead with compassion, and to face even the hardest challenges with dignity. When the broadcast ended, William remained seated, staring at nothing. Catherine entered, and without a word, pulled him into an embrace that finally allowed him to stop performing. "I do not know if I can do this," he whispered, the admission he could not make to anyone else. "You can," Catherine replied, holding him tightly. "You will, because you do not have a choice, and because you are stronger than you know. But not today. Today you are allowed to grieve." But both understood that the crown did not actually allow days off for grief. That kingship had claimed William the moment his father's heart stopped beating. By evening, the immediate constitutional crisis had been managed. William had been proclaimed king across all realms. The government had confirmed continuity. The machinery of state had adapted to its new sovereign with practiced efficiency. But in the private apartments the royal family gathered in grief, that protocol could not manage. Camilla sat alone in rooms that were no longer hers. Anne made arrangements with the funeral directors, and William sat with his children and tried to explain that while their grandfather was gone, the love he had given them remained. George, old enough to understand that his father becoming king meant his own future, had shifted irrevocably, asked the question haunting him. "Does this mean I will have to be king one day, even sooner than we thought?" William pulled his son close, feeling the weight of generational burden. "Yes," he said honestly. "One day, probably sooner than either of us would choose, but not today." "Today? Day we remember Grandpa. Tomorrow and all the days after, we will figure out together how to carry what he left us. The nation enters 10 days of mourning. Flags fly at half-mast across the Commonwealth, and King William V faces the impossible task of being both son grieving his father and sovereign serving his people. From which country are you watching this transition? Share your perspective below, because the passing of a monarch resonates differently worldwide. Thank you for bearing witness, for understanding that crowns cannot shield against mortality. and for recognizing that sometimes the greatest burden is the grief carried beneath it.